Good morning. My name is Steve Marr. I'm with Risk Management Professionals. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be spending about the next hour or so talking about a very important topic associated with PSM and RMP. If at any time you have difficulties with your computer or receiving our broadcast, please call 877-532-0806. That's the number on your screen in case you need somebody to help you out, and we'll be glad to do our best to help you move forward with that. The reason why we're doing this is an outgrowth of our professional engineering services associated with process safety management and risk management programs. This is something we do as consulting engineers. We help a lot of different types of facilities implement their program. Very typically, we get called in for hazard and operability studies, layer protection analysis, and a lot of the new requirements that are associated with facilities in California, safeguard protection analysis, hierarchy of hazard control analysis, and also that's previously known as inherently safer systems, and also damage mechanism reviews. This keeps us on our game. This helps us convey best practices internally, and also we can share those experiences and those tips with other folks in the PSM and RMP business who have to implement good quality programs. So that's why we're doing this. This is part of our outreach, and we use these opportunities to hone our experiences and capabilities internally, as well as convey tips to folks in industry who are responsible for these programs. Let's talk a little bit about logistics first. Actually, let me just back up a slide. Let's talk about logistics. Right now, what you've got on the screen is two images. In the center, you've got a PowerPoint presentation. On the left, you've got an image of the presenter. Either image can be resized. The image of the presenter can be moved around. And if at any time you need to talk to our producer, David Childs, he's available in the chat window, or the phone number that you saw previously, 877-532-0806, can be called to communicate important issues to us. At the end, there will be a question and answer session. We can take you off mute and allow you to participate if desired, or you can pose your questions via chat window to our producer, David Childs. Today's webinar will be focused on CalARP, RMP, and PSM common deficiencies and tips. RMP and PSM, as you know, are risk management plans and process safety management programs. CalARP is an example of a state accidental release prevention program, the one that's required in California. Our main presenters are going to be Colin Schultz and Jordan Schultz, and they will be providing a lot of background and specific tips. So let me introduce you and tell you who the speakers are a bit. Colin's a chemical engineer, licensed professional engineer in chemical engineering in California. He's got a lot of experience with HAZOP and LOPA facilitation on a wide variety of facilities, and has done dispersion modeling as well as many of the other elements of these safety management systems programs. For publications, just see our website. Colin joined me at has joined me at the Global Congress on Process Safety before, and has written numerous papers, and one of the ones on operating procedures is downloadable if desired. Jordan is also a chemical engineer, has experience facilitating HAZOP and LOPA studies to a wide variety of facilities, also has background in dispersion modeling and the other program elements of CalARP, RMP, and PSM. Also has done a number of publications, and those can also be downloaded from our website. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the topics. We'll start with an overlap, talking about the overlap of the different programs, periodic requirements, and then launch into various program deficiencies, things that you want to watch out for as things that trip up a lot of folks, things that we've observed, and also things that are changing with the new regulations and some OSHA interpretations that have come out. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Colin Schultz, and he'll start talking about program overlap.
Thank you, Steve. How's my audio coming through? All right, good morning, everyone. As Steve mentioned, we're going to quickly start out with some of the prevention program overlap. Just a quick overview on that, and then we'll dive into the meat of our discussion this morning regarding common deficiencies of the programs that risk management professionals has seen. And Jordan and I will be both speaking on that, so we'll switch about halfway through. So this matrix that you see on your slide, this is just to provide an overview and let you know that there are, at least in California, 4 different overlapping programs for 4 different government agencies. We have the EPA's Risk Management Plan, OSHA's Process Safety Management Program. In California, there's the CalARP program, which is the equivalent of EPA's RMP, and then CalOSHA PSM. So again, 4 different regulatory agencies with 4 different regulations. However, you can see that there's very few gaps in this table. So what that means is a PHA for RMP is effectively a PHA for OSHA, CalARP, OSHA, PSM. There are some slight nuances, but for all intents and purposes, it's relatively similar. And just moving on into the periodic requirements. These programs are living, breathing programs. Facilities have to do a lot of ongoing things in order to comply with the regulations, but there are a couple milestones that we want to call out specifically. There's an annual review and update of operating procedures. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the common deficiencies that we see with operating procedures, but in summary, a facility's procedures have to be reviewed and certified to be accurate every year. Moving on to the 3-year cycle, we have refresher training for employees and compliance audits. And compliance audits are not the same thing as a regulatory inspection. This is a formal audit done on the facility and its implementation of its CalARP or RMP or PSM program. Something important to note is that this does not have to be an external audit. It can be an internal audit by someone within your organization. The key points there just to ensure that it's someone who's qualified to perform the audit, and that they don't have any major conflicts of interest on that. On the 5-year cycle, we have the CalARP and RMP submittal. Every 5 years, at least every 5 years, facilities are required to submit some information, including a summary of their prevention programs and a couple other things to the administering agency or the EPA for CalARP and RMP. OSHA does not have a submittal requirement currently. This is, again, just for EPA and the state of California. As part of that, facilities have to update their hazard assessment and offsite consequence analysis every 5 years. And the PHA is done on a 5-year cycle as well, along with the seismic assessment in some parts of California. There are a couple items that could trigger facilities to update this more frequently than these baseline cycles. And those have been explained in previous webinars, and if you guys have questions on those, we'd be more than happy to answer those if you give us a call. Okay, as Steve mentioned in the beginning, we're going to dive into the program deficiencies, and these are mainly observed by us when we conduct compliance audits on facilities or when we're just interfacing with counterparts in industry, working on general program support or PHAs or development of procedures, etc. And it also comes from interfacing with regulatory agencies, either from being on site during inspections or just general discourse as we try and figure out the best way to comply with these regulations. We're also going to tangentially touch upon some of the new CalARP regulations that went into effect January 1st of this year. In case you guys didn't know that, give us a call afterwards, but yes, the CalARP regulations did change slightly. So we're going to talk about a couple of those minor issues as part of this presentation. However, for more detailed information, you can refer to our website. We have a previous webinar on those changes, and you can also, again, give us a call. So we're going to start out with the submittal element. Again, this is required to be done at least every 5 years. That's a long time, and I can't tell you, it happens a lot where facilities call us and have their submittal due in a week or two, and it's not impossible to meet that deadline. However, we do want to stress that facilities have 5 years to meet this deadline, and so we really suggest that you allocate your resources accordingly and set up a timeline in order to complete that on time. Typically with the administering agency, as long as facilities are open and upfront with them, they might have a little bit of leeway on the date, but again, coordinate with your administering agency on that. But EPA does have a firm anniversary date deadline, 5 years to the dot. So for example, if a facility submitted on September 16th of 2010, and they're finalizing their submittal today, September 17th of 2015, that is technically delinquent because it is greater than 5 years. However, the core thing that I really want to stress here is management system issues with the facilities management system, and that refers to management of the CalARP or RMP or PSM program. Common thread that we see with facilities that struggle to comply with these regulations is, and going a little bit more in detail, if they have trouble keeping their operating procedures updated, or not doing incident investigations, or not doing MOCs correctly, odds are that there are issues with their management system. So CalARP and RMP require that a documented management system is in place to ensure that there are people at your facility whose part of their roles and responsibilities is to enforce and follow up on these prevention program elements. If your facility doesn't have responsibilities assigned to a lot of these things, again, like operating procedures or management of change, then the facility is A, deficient in having a written documented management system, and B, odds are they're going to run into issues with their MOC program and their operating procedures because there's no employee assigned with the charge of ensuring that those are completed in line with the company's policies and procedures and the regulations. Additionally, the last item at the bottom, you can see there are some changes in ownership or contact information that a facility has to resubmit that information, or file that information with the EPA or the administering agency. Important thing to note is emergency contact information. A phone number and email address are supplied to the regulatory agencies. If that information changes, then facilities have to notify the EPA and their administering agency within 30 days. It's happened a decent amount of times when we go in to do a 5-year update and are reviewing the facility's emergency contact information on file with the EPA or the AA, and the emergency contact information might be 2 years out of date. And as a heads up, if you're in that situation, you are currently not in compliance with the regulations and are open to potential citations there. So the hazard assessment, again, is a solely CalARP and RMP portion. It's not a OSHA requirement. And it's comprised of the off-site consequence analysis, or OCA, which is the worst case and alternative release scenarios. And then it's also part of the, it also includes the 5-year accident history element. Most of the facilities that we deal with have not had any CalARP or RMP applicable releases, so as a result, the hazard assessment is often referred to as the OCA. The big issues that we see here are lack of clear documentation on the scenarios and how facilities came to those calculations for calculating the distance to endpoint or the quantity released. The more documentation you can have here, the better, just outlining your thought process and how facilities came to that information. On the revalidation side, this has to be updated at least every 5 years. And we have seen some facilities that are static and do not change a lot. And so in 2010, they did some modeling to show that they used their largest storage vessel, calculated a radius of impact for that worst case release scenario using RMP comp, and then plugged that value into some sort of population receptor program like Marplot, for example, and came up with a population for that. And then in 2015, when it's time to revalidate it, we've seen facilities just take a look at the calculations, see that nothing has changed in the process, and therefore rubber stamp it and say it's good to go. However, in those 5 years, there could be a lot of drastic changes with sensitive receptors, which not only includes residences, but hospitals, daycare facilities, schools, etc. And the 5-year update is meant to force facilities to take a second look at these sensitive receptors. So by failing to do that in your 5-year update, again, you're potentially opening yourself up to a deficiency. The process safety information, this is a very comprehensive set of documentation on a lot of the core technical information at your facility. This includes things like your PNIDs, the codes and standards the facility was designed and built to, design basis for the relief system, specification sheets on components and equipment and valves, etc., instrumentation. And the issue that we see a lot is most facilities are not static. Static facilities are ones who construct their facility and then nothing ever changes. These are generally simpler processes and don't have a lot going on. However, for more complex processes or those facilities that work in dynamic environments where changes are constantly being made, optimization is performed, etc., those should all trigger MOCs, which then have to ensure that your PSI is updated. And we really see a lot of facilities that struggle with keeping their PSI updated based on the changes that happen out in the field. And the regulations require that your PSI accurately reflect what's out in the field. And some examples would be like if a facility does an MOC to change some piping configuration or add a vessel or something like that, then if they do a good job on their MOC, they might attach the supporting information like redlined PNIDs or revised operating procedures to their MOC log, but a lot of times that information never makes it back into the master or controlled PSI. So as a result, when an auditor comes in and looks at the PSI, they'll be given the controlled copies of PNIDs or the controlled copies of operating procedures. And then separately, when they audit the MOC, they'll pull some random MOCs and see that there were updates made to the PNIDs or updates made to operating procedures that aren't consistent with whatever the controlled or the master set is. So that's something that's really difficult for facilities to comply with, but it's an easy thing for an auditor to pick up on. An additional item is compliance with RAGAP. Those are recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. I know that this is coming under more attention now with some of the recent developments with OSHA PSM. That's tricky for facilities to comply with. Chemical reactivity and corrosivity hazards. These are little pet peeves of mine. Most facilities, let me back up. The process safety information regulations require facilities to address hazards of the process chemical, and that includes things like toxicity information, permissible exposure limits, what to do in the event of a release or exposure to personnel, thermal stability hazards, and then chemical reactivity and corrosivity hazards. So a lot of facilities attempt to satisfy this requirement by having a copy of the safety data sheet, or SDS, which works well for some chemicals, but not all. Regulations, again, are specific in calling out these line items like chemical reactivity and corrosivity hazards. And I've seen a number of SDSs that don't call these out explicitly. And that's easy for a regulator to come in and just look at a checklist of the regulations that specify the PSI has to address these issues. And if those issues aren't explicitly addressed in the SDS, then regulators would dig a little bit deeper. And even though this could be true for chemicals, the SDS doesn't address corrosivity because the chemical is not corrosive. If it doesn't say that anywhere, a regulator is going to have their eyebrows raised because you're not documenting that you've thought about it and that you've looked into it. And as you'll see, which is a common thread in this, you don't document something and there's no proof that you've actually considered it or done it. Moving on to the PHA, again, this is done at least every 5 years unless some major changes trigger an update. We'll start right out. The regulations are clear in defining that personnel with knowledge and experience in engineering and operations must be present, and also someone with knowledge in the specific methodology being used. There have been instances where PHAs are conducted only with design engineers present, and the potential issue with that is there's no one with an operations background, and so that's potentially a violation of the regulation for an operating facility. Also, the PHA team not documented. We've seen a handful of PHA reports that look very good, but they don't document the team that was present. And so without having that documentation, there's no way to know if, A, there was someone with experience in engineering and operations present, which potentially opens up facilities to some issues. However, the big item that I want to touch upon for PHAs is recommendations not closed in a timely manner. You'll see this in bold and in red, and you'll see a couple of these throughout the presentation this morning, and you'll definitely realize that it's repeated for a purpose. This is a very big ticket item that auditors love to come in and look at whenever they get to the PHA. First thing they ask for is always, what's the status of recommendations from the last one? A change from the 2015 CalARP amendments is They now specify a time frame that recommendations have to be completed, which is within 2.5 years or during the next turnaround. You can deviate that if you have an agreed upon timeline with the AA, but again, that has to be documented. A number of times when we come in and do 5-year revalidations on PHAs, we'll look at the recommendations made during the last PHA, and a decent amount of time we start asking questions. Was this recommendation done? What documentation do you have on it? And a lot of times the answer is no. We end up having to close those recommendations on site as part of our PHA. That technically, facilities that are in that situation are deficient because they're not addressing their recommendations in a timely manner. The whole point of making a recommendation in a PHA is to close some sort of safety gap. So if you're not doing that, A, you're opening yourself up to regulatory citations, and then B, you are defeating the purpose of doing a PHA and making recommendations in the first place. Secondly, and I know Jordan's going to talk a little bit more about this, is lacking documentation for closed recommendations. It's not enough to do a recommendation and just be done with it in the field. You have to have documentation showing so-and-so completed this recommendation. This is how they completed that recommendation. It was signed off on this date. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't document it, then there's no proof that it ever happened. Operating procedures. As I mentioned in the beginning, operating procedures for Program 3 and PSM facilities have a requirement for an annual review and certification to be performed. Again, this is another big thing that auditors love to come in, and as soon as they get to the operating procedures element, they'll ask the facility, show me your annual certification for the past several years. And that's something very easy for an auditor to come upon, and if it hasn't been done for a year or two, then that's a potential citation right there. Another item that we want to point out is phases of operation not listed. The regulations are specific in requiring that the operating procedures address different modes of operation, such as normal startup, normal shutdown, normal operations, temporary operations, etc. A lot of small facilities don't have any temporary operations, so they just kind of leave that blank. But that kind of raises questions, or raises the eyebrow of an auditor, because it's not documented that we thought about it. Do we have temporary operations? No, we don't. It's okay to put there are no temporary operations for this process. Really what auditors are looking for is to ensure that facilities have reviewed all the different modes of operation and have thought about them and assigned procedures to fit those. And the last big thing that I want to touch upon here is operating limits and consequences of deviation. Operating limits are kind of tied back to the PSI. This information typically includes safe process parameters for the process to operate in. So that would be things like pressure, temperature, flow, etc. The operating procedures have to address consequences of deviation if that process deviates from those operating limits. So for example, if you have a process that normally operates from 100 to 200 PSIG, then there should be a consequence of deviation to say what happens or what is the response if you go above 200 PSIG or below 100 PSIG. That's what auditors are looking for. Something else to note is that these don't have to be process parameters. There are other parameters as well. For example, wall thickness on vessels and piping. That's kind of tied into the mechanical integrity element, because your PSI should define what acceptable limits are for your, again, piping and equipment. And then in the mechanical integrity element, if your inspections and tests find that you're deviating from those defined limits, then you have to be able to correct those in a safe and efficient manner. I'm going to wrap up my portion this morning with a quick discussion on training. The regulations are clear that initial training has to be provided to every employee that works on or near the covered process, and that refresher training must be completed at least every 3 years. A lot of facilities do refresher training more than 3 years, but again, the requirement is just 3 years. The one thing that we see a lot of is just poor documentation on training, which we understand is difficult for facilities, because training, there's a number of different trainings that go on at facilities that's not specific to CalARP and RMP and PSM. There's a lot of other stuff that they have to maintain records on. However, the regulations are explicit in the documentation that's required for this training, and that's things like the name of the employee being trained, the name of the trainer, the date the training took place, and most importantly, the means used to verify that the employee understood the training. A lot of times that last item is left out, and we just see training records saying so-and-so was trained by this trainer on this date. And the problem then there is that it doesn't show how the trainer was able to validate that the employee understood the training. This could be things like written tests or oral exams or just demonstrations showing that the employee is able to demonstrate to the trainer that he or she understood the training. However, again, you have to document it. Documentation is the key here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to continue on.
As Colin noted, I'm Jordan. I'll be taking over the second half and running us through. We're going to start with mechanical integrity. Written procedures not being available, not complete, or not implemented. It sounds pretty simple, but a lot of times this is an item that is very deficient. A lot of times we're very reliant on contractors or experienced maintenance personnel knowing what needs to be done and how often. However, if this isn't written down and you're not keeping track of how often these things are doing, or making sure the inspection and maintenance is not performed or not conducted and documented, that's oftentimes a deficiency we see, or it's being done late, or you're filling out the form saying, oh yeah, we did our weekly check, but you're filling them out 4 or 5 times at once. They may have happened, but it's a deficiency if you're not documenting that these are happening on time and closing them out on time. Another one oftentimes is the frequency isn't consistent with industry standards. IIR, API, a lot of these industry groups put together great documents telling you how often you need to be looking at some of these items. But if you're not following those, you're going to be deficient, or at least it's going to raise a lot of red flags saying, well, why do you feel like the industry group says you need to do this every 6 months, but you're doing it yearly? Piping issues are also oftentimes not addressed. Making sure that you're looking at wall thickness, like Colin had talked about earlier, in both vessels and piping is very fundamental in making sure that you maintain the integrity of your system. And as part of these inspections, sometimes you're going to go ahead and note equipment deficiencies. Instrumentation might not be working, or you're noticing a leak in a flange. If you're not documenting that, but also not correcting it in a safe or timely manner, that's a deficiency. Obviously, you're noting an unsafe condition, both from a regulatory compliance standpoint as well as a safety aspect. This is not the ideal way of going about it. Continuing on with mechanical integrity, making sure that you're documenting your preventative maintenance schedule with your contractor. It sounds pretty simple. However, a lot of times, especially in certain industries like ammonia refrigeration, a lot of the maintenance work is being done by the contractor. They're very knowledgeable in the process, but you should have at least a log sheet saying your contractor is going to come out on a biweekly, monthly basis, however it is, and that they're going to do these items, and then having some form of verifying that these items are done. Contractors are used to this. They're very good to work with. They'll help you guys roll these things out, but you need to be making sure that you're not only documenting the maintenance that your own employees are doing, but also the contractors. Quality assurance plan not being in place. This is another one. Just making sure that not only is this mechanical integrity occurring, but also that it's being done correctly. And sufficient information not being available for piping and equipment to understand the hazards. Older systems, this can oftentimes be a problem. You might not still have the O&M manuals for certain equipment, so it's very difficult to gauge what the frequencies of inspections are that would be appropriate. If you don't have that information, it can be very difficult, obviously, as you don't know if you need to be doing it more frequently because of the differences in certain pieces of equipment. The manager MOC procedure. This is a procedure that's very simple from a regulatory standpoint, but it's very difficult to maintain for certain facilities, especially if there's a lot of change going on. The first one would be obviously that the procedure isn't being used or not being used correctly. As part of that documentation, you need to be making sure that you're looking at what exactly are you changing and how does this affect how the process works and your personnel safety. As part of that, when you change, you need to be changing your prevention program documentation. If you're not updating this to reflect changes, essentially your program is becoming outdated. It's supposed to be an evergreen program where you're going ahead and changing things frequently. The management of change is obviously triggered by a not-in-kind change, so you are minimum changing your PSI. Oftentimes, this is also going to affect your operating procedures and maintenance. So you need to be making sure this is the way of identifying what is changing and how things need to be implemented. Another big problem is personnel not adequately notified of the change. As part of MOC procedures, you need to be making sure you're training affected personnel on the change. If it's just an email, you need to be making sure oftentimes you need to be doing something more like brief training, or at least making sure that they're comfortable with the change, they know what's happened, and how that affects operations. Need for modifications to existing operating and or maintenance procedures, or whether these new procedures are needed as not assessed. This ties back to the prevention program documentation. You need to be making sure that your operating procedures, your mechanical integrity are up to date, and the operators know what has been changed. And MOC procedures are not completed or signed prior to startup. MOC is your way of catching any kind of safety hazards or changes to the way you're operating the system prior to implementing the change. Obviously, if the system is already changed and you're starting back up and you haven't closed out your MOC, it is defeating the spirit of what MOC was put in place for. You haven't made sure that all of your safety hazards or all the changes necessary have occurred prior to starting up. Pre-startup safety review, or PSSR. It's similar to the procedure not being documented. It's a lot like MOC in that regard, or not keeping the documentation on file, or just going ahead and completing it following the implementation. Your PSSR is a checklist oftentimes that you're going to go ahead and make sure, hey, these are the items we've defined in the MOC that have changed and need updating. Your PSSR is that final verification check to make sure that, yeah, everything has been done, we're safe to start up. So obviously if you haven't got that completed prior to startup, it's kind of like the MOC. You've identified hazards or problems, but you haven't done it before starting up, so it's sort of in vain. And if the PSSR is not documented or conducted independently of the MOC, like I've been saying, this PSSR is there to be the final verification of your MOC being implemented. So if you're doing them all at once, you're not really encapsulating the spirit of what PSSR was designed for. Compliance auditing. Once again, we've got another red bold. Recommendations not being corrected or completed. Just as a brief rundown, you have 3 things for recommendation closure timelines. You can agree upon a timeline with your administering agency, or they're going to be due 1.5 years from when the audit was completed. For refineries and other places, also you have during the next planned turnaround. Compliance audit that's not completed by the anniversary date. This is a very common one. A lot of times you often are thinking about that 5-year update with a PHA and your hazard assessment that's very important. And then compliance audits can oftentimes slip under the radar. But these are often much more out of compliance than your 5-year update materials. No documentation is included regarding your audit scope, methods used, or findings. You can't just go ahead and say that, yeah, we went ahead and reviewed the regulations, reviewed our program, and we felt comfortable. It needs to have like a front-end report that's stating exactly how you reviewed this for compliance, who was involved, what was found, how did we do it, and most importantly, once again, the recommendations. These were our deficiencies. Here's how we're going to close them. Program implementation not verified with facility personnel. This is another one where you oftentimes will run into some issues. Involve the facility. You're going to have to ask some interview questions. Go ahead and look around. Don't just look at the paperwork. Actually make sure you're looking at some of the extra information behind it. Completion dates of recommendations not included in documentation. This goes back to same sorts of things with recommendations. I'll touch a little bit further on that in a bit, but oftentimes what I suggest to facilities is going ahead and as part of that the report, after you go ahead and go through some worksheets and document how you guys are compliant or not compliant, have a separate appendix that goes ahead and puts an action tracking log in. Here is the deficiency we found and how we're going to correct it. Here is the person assigned to it. Here is the date he needs to get it done by. And here is how it was completed. Another one that I see quite often is not keeping the two most recent audits on file. A lot of times, and this has actually changed a little bit recently as part of the 2015 updates to CalARP. There used to be a 5-year, you can go ahead and throw it away if it's more than 5 years old. Now you need to keep the most recent 2. So you should hold on to 6 years worth of audits at minimum. Incident investigation, yet again we have the red bold comment on no follow through on recommendations. We'll touch on it again just in a bit. It's got a similar requirements on closure as does compliance auditing. You can agree with timeline with the administering agency. If you don't, these are going to be due a 1.5 years following the investigation completion or 2 years after the date of the incident. You don't have any choice. It has to be whichever one of those 2 dates is earlier. And also, you can go ahead and do it during the next planned turnaround. That has to be occurring within the 1.5 year margin, obviously. Investigation not initiated within 48 hours of the incident. Questions often arise on what constitutes not initiating. That isn't reporting, I guess would be a question that I've often seen. It's going ahead when you convene that team, and then you go ahead and start the process of trying to figure out what happened and what you can do to fix it. Findings are not shared with affected personnel. A lot of times people do incident investigations and they do them correctly. However, you're investigating the incident to go ahead and figure out what went wrong, to share that information with employees and make sure it doesn't occur again. If you're not circulating the report amongst the affected personnel and keeping them involved in the investigation, they may not know what the cause is and it could happen again. Required information not documented during the investigation or in the report. They have a pretty extensive, and it's quite well spelled out in most of the regulations regarding what information they want. Make sure that it's all documented. No investigation or documentation of near misses. The regulations explicitly state, a significant release or something that had the potential for a significant release or personnel issue as the definition of a near miss, and it needs to be documented. Obviously, near misses, if you look at kind of some of the more classic process safety methodologies, at the base of a pyramid, you have a lot of unsafe conditions. These things occur with relative frequency, but it doesn't really amount to anything. Then there's oftentimes it's gone and escalated a little bit from there, one step up the pyramid, and this unsafe condition could potentially easily have led to a release or something of that nature. That's when you start getting into that near miss column. Another step above that, you have, say, a minor release or your PSV is lifted, something like that. That shouldn't be normal operation. This is, yet again, a near miss. Nothing bad happened. The public or personnel weren't affected, but they very easily could have. You had a loss of containment. And then if you keep ignoring these things, then you're going to have releases that will potentially affect the public or personnel. They're obviously much, much rarer in the unsafe conditions, but if you're not going ahead and looking at what's going wrong, from a statistical standpoint, eventually it will happen. Completion dates not documented for recommendations or deficiencies. This is, yet again, follows through on recommendation closure. You guys go ahead and, as part of these incident investigations, come up with ideas on what happened and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. But if you aren't taking any actions or developing the documentation to show what you did, oftentimes you aren't doing what is needed. Employee participation. Written plan not documented and or shared with the facility personnel. You're going to be involving your employees in this process of developing and maintaining these programs. However, there should be, kind of like Colin touched on with management systems, delineated tasks where certain personnel are doing other things, and you need to be making sure that you get an eclectic and clear look. This program is made for keeping maintenance, operations, engineers, and other plant personnel all safe. So you want to make sure that you get as much knowledge and insight from the different groups as you possibly can. Personnel involved with the covered process operations are not aware of where the CalARP, RMP, or PSM documentation and procedures are located. One of my favorite questions to ask during compliance audits are talking to those operators and just grabbing somebody random and saying, hey, where is your CalARP, RMP, or PSM binder? Where's the documentation, or where can I find this? It's shocking, or depending on how close you are to the program, not shocking at all. how often some of these operators or maintenance personnel may not know where that is, or even what you're talking about. Personnel not involved with program development. You want to make sure, once again, that you're involving as many people as possible. Granted, I'm not condoning that you put 45 people into a PHA, but you want to make sure that you're at least getting a knowledge base that has everything included in it when you're doing some of these items. And documentation not in the language of the operator or user. If they can't read it or understand or comprehend it, you're really not doing anything. You've just got a very large stack of papers if it's not able to be digested. Hot work permit. Personnel not being trained or knowledgeable on the procedures. This goes back to kind of training and everything, where you need to make sure that if people are doing hot work on the system, they know exactly what they need to be doing. Records are not documented or not kept on file. You have both the training records and your hot work permits, making sure that you're keeping those documented correctly and you're filing where it's needed. Or hot work area is not field verified by the supervisor. This is another one that's very common. Supervisors can be very busy, especially at some larger facilities. However, they need to go ahead and make sure that they are spot checking this as hot work. Oftentimes can lead to unsafe conditions. Contractors. This item comes up often. I've had several calls after the fact on some of these issues. No documentation regarding contractor training or procedures for conducting work and maintenance on the covered process. People oftentimes, it's not very explicitly spelled out in the regulation, but you need to kind of treat a contractor similar to an employee while they're on your facility. They need to make sure that you have clear documentation that states this person that's doing the work understands what he's supposed to be doing, the hazards involved, and things like that. Also, they need to have procedures. Just like you would have, your company would have maintenance or operating procedures written out, they should have written or trained on these operating procedures and maintenance procedures for the covered process. As part of the general safety, lack of contractor or visitor safety training. They should know what's on site. They should also be relatively familiar with your emergency plans. They should know if they hear an alarm, what that alarm means, and where to go. And then lack of a periodic evaluation of contractors. All these regulations ask that you go ahead and do safety audits and make sure that they're performing in line with what your safety culture would be. Emergency planning and response. One of the biggest ones, and this comes up a lot, is emergency response plans versus emergency action plans. Not knowing the difference is obviously a big issue. Emergency response plan, the key word in that being response. Your facility is going to go ahead and you guys are putting on your protective PPE, you're putting on everything, and you're going to go ahead and try and fix this problem. Whereas an emergency action plan, you'll take some basic actions while you're egressing from the situation, hit your e-stop buttons, make sure that people are safe, but you're going to the muster points and allowing the fire department or hazmat team, whoever is your responder in the area, to go ahead and deal with it as they do. Not having the correct plan in place. Everyone wants to think, the emergency response plans are easy, but it's very difficult, and if you're not going to respond, you want to make sure that you have an emergency action plan. They have different requirements, and the procedures are different. Also not meeting emergency response requirements by the other agencies. Making sure that you're coordinating is the fundamental issue, especially with emergency action plans. Your responders should know what's on site and then how to deal with that, which means you need to go ahead and coordinate with those guys, at least on a regular basis. And another thing, as part of that annual basis, go ahead and do an annual review. The regulations don't explicitly require this. However, it is the suggested frequency by OSHA, and as such, industry has generally accepted that as well. I would suggest going ahead and going about that. You may be able to argue one way or the other, but it's probably the industry best practice. Also, you need to have that response plan written down. People ask about where these things should be located. Oftentimes, we've gone ahead and said that the intranet on the company side is a good place to do it. It's very easily accessible, and it makes controlling the document much easier. But there are certain areas, say remote operator sheds or other places where you'd want to have a hard copy. The more copies you print off, the more difficult it is to control, but you also don't want to be leaving these things out just because you want to keep one controlled copy. Most common program-wide deficiency, recommendation follow-up. You've seen it in bold quite a few times throughout the webinar. Regarding recommendation follow-up, things we've found that work the best are having an actionability type of meeting. We're going to go ahead and look at whatever your PHA team or your compliance auditing team, incident investigation team have recommended, and then bring everyone together, especially the movers and shakers that will be in charge of implementing some of this stuff, and go, okay, here's the recommendations we had. Review and make sure that the wording makes sense, because with the people that will go ahead and be actioning these, and then also assigning who will be taking care of that recommendation, what the timeline they'll need for completing that recommendation should be, and then it'll also have boxes that will go ahead and give you the completion date and notes for following up on it. Follow regulatory requirements when it comes down to assigning those completion dates. Obviously, it used to say in a timely manner. Now you have 2.5 years regarding the PHA, and give or take a year and a half on compliance auditing and incident investigation. We've already talked about those specific requirements. You're going to be out of compliance if you go ahead and assign those to be later. Document the actions taken to address those recommendations, and make sure you're clearly labeling that they're closed, and record that date of completion when it is closed. Colin talked about it earlier. It is oftentimes an issue that we see where you'll go through, and if you, especially you haven't been doing very diligently for years, it's very difficult to try and close them out correctly all at once. So people oftentimes just label it closed. The problem with that logic being that if you did a PHA, and let's just say you neglected it and you come back to it 5 years later and you just close it out, you might have done that recommendation. However, if you don't have a date assigned to it that says, yes, we completed it before this timeline ran out, they're going to go ahead and have to assume that it wasn't done on time. That kind of comes back to this maxim, no documentation equals a deficiency. Regarding some of the new regulatory updates, some of the things that have been changing, OSHA has gone ahead and released some interpretation and enforcement letters in June and July of this year. The first one would be a RAGAGEP, or Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practices. They let you know on how they would like to see you document RAGAGEP. This was an OSHA PSM RFI topic, which would indicate to me that this has been a point of contention for them, and to make sure that you're going ahead and read that letter. It's basically telling you how to induce industry standards and other things like that to make sure that you're documenting that you are following RAGAGEP. The retail exemption. This is a pretty big one. Once again, it also comes back to the RFI they've released. Basically, their clarification states that if a facility doesn't fall under the SIC code of 44 or 45, you're not considered a retail facility eligible for the exemption. They initially kind of let that out, and it was supposed to be immediate, but they've gone ahead and now stated that, you know, this enforcement is going to start coming around mid-January of 2016, or 6 months after they had released that letter, basically to give facilities the chance to work with OSHA in consultation to make sure that their program development or program levels have changed, making sure that they're compliant and they have time to go ahead and do that rather than scramble all at once. And then covered concentrations. This is another new change. They've moved towards EPA's 1% policy rather than what they used to, which was called the, quote, commercial grade policy. For some clarification there, that doesn't apply to things that are already explicitly stated. So aqueous ammonia at 44% or 52%, 44%. They're not going to go ahead and require a 1% there. It's more dealing with chemicals like formaldehyde, where you'll have various concentrations depending on your product of formalin. You'll go ahead and do 1% rather than rely on the commercial grade. So basically, you're going to go ahead and say, here is the total weight of the covered chemical, and then here's what we have. This would be how you determine threshold quantity. Also, just as a note, supposedly there are at least 3 or 4 interpretation or enforcement letters that are reported to follow up in the near future. Judging by all of these being PSM RFI topics. I would expect several of them, if not all of them, to want to be addressing similar RFI topics until they can go ahead and get the PSM legislation finalized. In California, Senate Bill 612 has been moving. It gives the CUPA or UPA general duty clause. Basically, this is something that the EPA RMP already has. Things they note, it might not be regulatory explicitly required, but they can go ahead and require other things under the general duty. New mapping requirements, oftentimes LEPCs or other agencies may have specific requirements when it comes to mapping. You're going to have to go through a bureaucratic process to state that this is our policy and then have it written out instead of just kind of word of mouth. They've changed other UPA programs like underground and above ground storage tanks, spill prevention countermeasures, hazardous waste. For more information on that, we went ahead and provided the link. Go ahead and look at that. It'll give you the bill, its progress, etc. Just a quick status update. CalARP, we've been talking about it. The new amendments took effect January 1st of 2015. There's been some movement towards what they call Program 4. This is going to be explicitly for refineries. NAICS code 32411 is that one. If you aren't 32411, you're not going to have to worry about these elements right away. It's going to be due in early 2016. CalOSHA is also doing a similar element to Program 4. They started it with 5189.1 or PSM for refineries. Once again, if you're not in that 32411 NAICS code for petroleum refining, it's not going to apply to you, and they're going to be rolling out simultaneously or very, very close to each other with CalARP and CalOSHA's refinery enforcement specialties. US EPA is at the notice of proposed rulemaking, should be published soon. They were projecting September 2015. It hasn't came out quite yet, so it'll either be at the end of this month or very shortly after that. They're currently trying to draft the regulations once they've proposed this rulemaking. OSHA is in the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Act, or SPREVPA panel. They started that in 2015. This is another part. EPA and OSHA both have two different regulatory models, but they're both moving forward with these RFI topics. They should be drafting regulations soon as well. Here's a reference page. I would go ahead and especially point you towards our regulatory update webpage. There's a lot of stuff, previous webinars on the topics we've been talking about, papers, publications, and also links to some of these other things that we've already been referencing to. Stay tuned. We've obviously kept hosting these webinars. Topics coming up include October 22nd, Urban Water Management Plan updates. The 27th, we'll be making sense of OSHA's new PSM interpretations. The 10th will be case studies in process safety. And December 3rd, applications of HAZOP LOPA during design phase. With that, I'm going to head it back to Steve. He's going to give a couple more updates, and then we'll open up for question and answer.
Yeah, right before the question and answer session, what I'd like to do is just re-emphasize on the references page. We take a lot of steps to make sure our regulatory updates page on our website is up to date, and you've got links to basically all those new regulatory requirements that we've been talking about, as well as links to existing copies of regulations. We've designed it to be one-stop shopping to make sure it's available for lots of different folks. And also, just to emphasize, a lot of the discussions that Jordan and Colin have been making today apply to a wide range of facilities. For those of you in the ammonia refrigeration business, you are aware that Risk Management Professionals is a very active proponent of the Refrigerating Engineers and Technicians Association, or RETA. We will be exhibiting at the annual conference in Milwaukee. That's from September 29th through October 2nd. If you're planning to go, please stop by. If you're not planning to go and you're very active in RETA or in the refrigeration industry, you might want to take a look at what's going on. There's a lot of very valuable information items, courses, and interactions that can be obtained there. Also separately, on October 29th, up in Kern County, risk management professionals will be co-hosting a workshop, co-hosting it with the Kern County Environmental Resources Group. Environmental and Health Group, I believe it is. And we'll be co-hosting a workshop that's meant to focus on many of the issues associated with PSM, RMP, and CalARP as they apply to a lot of different types of facilities, and especially of interest in the afternoon for the oil and gas folks will be a lot of the new developments that have been promulgated in draft form on May 26th for Cal-OSHA, Process Safety Management, and also the California Excellent Release Prevention Program. So with that, and you've got lots of information at your disposal with respect to upcoming webinars and previously recorded ones, what we're going to do is start our question and answer session, and I'll turn it back to Colin and Jordan.